Hello, and welcome to Social Evolution, a podcast where we talk about the future of humanity and a whole lot of things related to that. And my name is Michael Porcelli, and I'm joined by my friend here,
Max Borders. Good to be with you.
It's good to be with you too, Max. Today, we're talking about these kind of related ideas of sense making, shared reality, collective intelligence, which I think is especially relevant in today's world, because this whole idea that we live in a post-truth world or a postmodern society, these are kind of hot topics. So we're going to talk about that and what that looks like going into the future.
Right on. And look, I mean, I always have to give you props when you're an expert on something. And I think this is one of those areas where, your meta relating practice involves literally, I mean, and this is at a small scale. This is a few people generally, or a small group, say at work or at home, but it's weaving shared reality is what you call it. There's a great piece, Porcelli, that you actually have online that people should check out called Weaving Shared Reality. And it was one of the inspirations for a couple of the chapters in my book on collective intelligence.
Yeah. And Max is the author of the really brand new book called After Collapse. And he talks about the future and the possible collapse scenarios that we might be facing as a civilization. And specifically, you get into one of the major factors that could lead to collapse is this breakdown in shared reality, this breakdown in collective intelligence, this breakdown of even being able to know what's true or not, or what does the evidence say or doesn't it, and how that is in and of itself a risk factor. And your book is titled After Collapse, so we talk a little bit about, well, how would we be able to do that into the future? Like if we kind of go through one of these collapse scenarios, or if we're in the middle of one of these collapse scenarios, like how can we put that back together in a way that is maybe an improvement or an upgrade to the way we've been doing sense making and collective intelligence that kind of got us into this mess in the first place.
Yeah, I have to say, the solution set of the book in chapter 13 is the most tentative for me. In other words, it's such a deep rabbit hole of a problem. So, one of the reasons we're going to put our heads together today, is because this is such a problematic, both philosophically, in other words, in terms of our epistemology, our ways of knowing about the world, as well as our mediated mechanisms of knowing. We are all mediated by screens, to the point that it almost seems like a hall of mirrors, that our reality is so mediated now. We are trying to know a lot about the wider world, and we are presented with all of this flood of information and opinions and videos and this and that, and it gets rather polluted.
Yep. Yeah. So we're gonna dive into it. I think I kind of want to share a little bit something on a personal note, or just how I've related to this in my own history, and then we'll talk a little bit about this post-truth world, fake news, and all this that's going on around us that we can't seem to get away from. But I remember, I was very nerdy in high school. I was kind of at the top of the class, and teacher's pet and all this kind of stuff. And I remember having these feelings, like that I wanted to know it all. I mean, I sort of came across as one of those annoying know-it-alls sometimes, but like I really wanted to, and I really thought it was possible. I really thought, I remember my adolescent mind going like, and then there's going to be a time when I finally know it all, and it just all fits together. And then the more I became educated, the more, especially like my college years were just completely and utterly humbling. I was like, whoa, this is crazy. It was almost like the more I found out about stuff, especially in my specialized fields of like engineering and computer science, the more I realized how much more I did not know. It was kind of a nutty kind of realization, but I remember that feeling. And then it's a little it's a little bit overwhelming, a little bit humbling, and also just a little bit like, I don't know what to do with that. Like somehow I have to basically just fucking give up on knowing it all and just accept that it's going to be fucking limited no matter how much more I know. I'm just going to hit there's just a limit, right? I mean, I got to live my life, right? I'm not just here to store all humanity's knowledge in my brain. It wouldn't even fucking fit, right? Like I mean, it's a weird feeling.
Yeah. Oh, I relate so much to that feeling. And the first thing that humility gave to me back then, at least in college years, was this not just a humility, but almost worse than that, a nihilism.
Yeah.
Like, wow, we really are constrained in these various ways. What I came to discover is no less humbling, but that the more we know, the more we're opening new doors, new pathways to inquiry, so that it is a constant process. You're sort of opening a door to a new room in which you open a new door to a new room, and it's this fractal. You're sort of accreting this fractal of information, and in so doing, trying to keep it in coherence.
Yeah.
And that is a beautiful thing. It is a kind of unfolding that is more beautiful and more complex as you age, but it also leaves you much in the way Socrates was left, which is the more you know, the more you realize that you know very little. And
Yeah.
so that paradox of knowledge, I think, um, is something that we can never fully escape, but one that we have to reckon with in trying to, as you put it, we've shared reality and aim towards truth tracking or collective intelligence.
Yep. Totally. Yeah. I was just reminded of when you brought Socrates up. It's like, well, a mark of wisdom, according to the oracle, was that he knew that he didn't know, right? And I'm hoping that if you've relating to anything Max and I are sort of sharing, like maybe the depression or nihilism that comes from realizing the limits of your knowledge can sort of be buttressed perhaps by a sense of growing wisdom and having a healthy skepticism and an intellectual humility about your own views, and maybe even seeing that as a good thing in and of itself, even though knowing everything is
And
impossible.
also with a critical eye, and I mean critical thinking, not critical theory,
Yeah.
which is to say, this is really one of those domains that you probably can't know.
Mm-hmm.
And your line of inquiry here should leave you humble, not having all the answers. And we'll get more into that today when we discuss expertise, the problem of expertise, and so on. I mean, there's so many dimensions to claims to knowledge sets.
Yeah.
We know that there are people who are smarter than others. We know there are people who work their entire lives to become experts in some discipline or domain, and we have to respect that. But we also have to require of them that they respect the limits of their expertise. And in these days, there's so much faith on expertise that is perhaps unwarranted and even dangerous.
Yeah. So let's get there. I mean, I think especially I don't even know when people there's all these different catchphrases seem like they caught on the last 4 years, like post truth, fake news. That's fake
Mm-hmm.
news. That's fake news. Alternative facts was another one that sort of had a little moment in the sun, and like and
Truthiness.
truthiness. It was like it's kind of humorous in a way. I think there's perhaps a kind of nihilism that some people have embraced that scares me. I mean, to the degree it is embraced sincerely, this idea that I guess we are in a post-truth world and guess we just have to fucking accept it. It's like, no, no, no. Like the part of me that like gets how engineering and science works, is like, no, you don't just get to fucking make it up and planes fly and cars run and economics and our whole civilization works together because we can converge, right? Using our tools of the scientific method and engineering and collective intelligence and sense making, like build stuff that in fact works because it is grounded in some understanding of how the physical universe works. So I think that's important to remember. But I think this entire uh situation that we're in, I think, has been incredibly amplified in the age of the internet, partly because there's just so much more information available. Sometimes I think of have you heard of this like law of the infinite cornucopia? I can't remember which thinker thought of this one. It's a funny one. It's almost like you can just go, hey, I think whatever. And then you could just like type in whatever into like a search engine and essentially find evidence for that thing. It's like there's just so much
Mm.
information, you could literally find evidence for anything you want to find evidence for.
You can. It's a confirming your biases
Yeah.
cornucopia.
Exactly. We're just in an information situation where there's so much of it that we can, if we wanted to, confirm any bias we wanted by finding other people saying or thinking things that are close enough that we're like, see, I'm right. It's crazy.
Yeah.
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 And I think if you stretch it back, there was kind of this emergence of, early 20th century, early to mid 20th century thought kind of hit some really interesting breakdowns, some of which were more along the lines of this kind of continental philosophy, critical theory, the kind of progenitors of postmodern thought that kind of
Mm-hmm.
really took off with the French in the mid 20th century, but also
Mm-hmm.
certain things like Hilbert's program and the kind of the attempt to the formalists in math and to try to like secure math on logical footing, or this idea that like all these things are going to end up being consistent, and then Gödel's incompleteness theorem kind of comes along and it's like, wait a minute, we can't do that. Like these weird projects, kind of almost like the peak of the modernist sort of formalism, kind of broke down in a way that it's never recovered from.
And science can, perhaps more familiar to people in the hard sciences is the
Yes.
apparent breakdown of our traditional scientific method and epistemology with respect to Heisenberg's uncertainty principle.
Yep.
Or Niels Bohr, the phenomena of the very small, the theory of relativity on the macro level.
Yes.
These are all areas where we took our scientific lenses and that discipline and found limits both to the objects of inquiry as well as the inquiry itself.
Totally.
And there's this kind of feedback loop that caused us to question everything.
Everything.
And yet that was tremendously fruitful. So, it's not to say that the postmodern project and the kinds of insights that came out of postmodernism are all shit, because they're not.
Mm-hmm.
They leave us in a kind of a circuitous irony that can be playful but not fruitful. It's only fruitful, generally speaking, in service of power assertions. And I want to, and that's fruitful for someone who's asserting the power and are successful in making those assertions. But beyond that, that's not the same thing as weaving shared reality. That is not the same thing as trying to appreciate or apprehend that which is a mind-independent reality and navigate it together as a human community. Those are two different projects. And I'm not saying that's all postmodernism.
Yeah.
What I am saying is that's what has been distilled and taken from the postmodern project, is that power assertion model. More or less. And so we can talk about the details of that, but I think we are living in a postmodern, de facto postmodern age, by virtue not just of the strands of postmodernism that are still holding sway in people's minds, but we're also in it because of the technological nature of our interactions now as being mediated by screens and digits.
Yeah, totally. And I think it kind of bears maybe one more stroke on the historical thing. Like we saw a similar kind of, I suppose, bounty of misinformation that happened in the wake of the printing press, right? Like witch hunts and all, crazy conspiracy theories during that time. Like there was a way we kind of think maybe we were taught in school, like, hey, the scientific progress and modernism, and it was all like this printing press, and it was great. Now the facts are out there, and people are sharing facts, and it's like that did happen. But the other thing that also happened was a bunch of nonsense spread like crazy. And I remember in my college years when I first encountered the internet, this was back in the early 90s. I was like, this is incredible. This is going to change everything. Like all of the knowledge can essentially be digitized and can essentially just be sent around at like basically little to no transactional costs, right? Like we don't need paper anymore. It was just kind of like you can kind of see the implications of this. And I think in my idealism at that age, I was like, this is going to be a whole new frontier of like more knowledge, like more understanding. Remember, like I just shared, my adolescent mind was like, oh my God, we're going to,
Me too. And Sturgeon's law came out pretty soon thereafter. I think the paraphrase is 90% of everything on the internet is shit. Which is not even Pareto, right?
Yeah.
That's not even 20%. I mean, it's like, so it's funny that he made it 10%, but there's a, what's so funny about Sturgeon's law is it has the benefit of being truthy. In other words, 90% of everything out there really is kind of shit.
Yeah.
And we have to learn to wade through it in order to grab on to any facet of reality that will allow us, at least in a pragmatic sense, to form this kind of intersubjective solidarity that we're looking for in this topic of conversation today.
Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. I mean, I've gotten kind of scared in a way in especially this past year, right? We're in the, we're still inside of a, COVID-19 pandemic, and
this is so, oh gosh, that's such a good example. I mean, I when you said, as soon as you said, the pandemic,
yeah,
you're just spot on. It's like,
oh yeah,
remember we had the 2017 or so, we had this discussion, Jordan Hall about the Blue Church. Curtis Yarvin, a couple years before, was talking about the cathedral.
Yep.
It is essentially this idea. It's a symbol of, in the church, and the church hierarchy is the main, domain of comparison, because it's like we have these institutions that are supposed to be the stewards of knowledge,
right,
and truth. And so we have this modernist idea that persists to this day, and people are absolutely slavish to it as a religion, which is, we get these quotes during the pandemic: trust the experts, right?
Yep.
Which is basically say, don't trust yourself. You are not an expert. You are not a steward of knowledge. Follow, obey, and we'll all be okay if you trust the experts. And they're
follow
like
the science.
fucking zombies, right?
Yeah. And
oh my God, the experts were just wrong left and right. It's just a litany of poor decisions on the part of experts, as well as poor advice and poor claims to knowledge. Everything from the noble lies about not wearing a mask that came from the same man who was dressing us down for not wearing masks, to, the idea that some authorities should be holding back life-saving vaccines to make sure they're safe, putting the pause button on them because a couple of people, tiny subset of people showed these blood clots. But you measure that against the daily death toll, and it's like, stop it. Let people take their risks, be aware of the risks quickly, and then get this stuff to market, and people can make their own risk assessment. And yet, people are often terrible at assessing risks. Like relative risk and risk analysis is just not something that people can do very well, at least. Anyway, there's just so much here. With this subject matter, like I could rattle on, but let's put it another way. We know that there are people, we've talked before about the idea that people have cognitive limitations. Yeah. Right. We also know that there are expertise limitations. Right. Would you would you do surgery on yourself or someone you loved? Right. Would you? No. Of course not. That's amateur hour. We there are certain things, of course, we want expertise on, but How is it that you can develop a lens of mistrust or skepticism for expertise? How do you do that personally?
Well, we come back to that in just a second. I mean, I think, just for the listeners, to whatever degree you maybe found yourself like either resonating with some of the skepticism Max described or not, really take a step back and try to answer the question Max is posing to me for yourself, right? I mean, another refrain from this past year has not just been trust the experts, it's also been do your own research. Do your own research, man. Get out there and figure it out for yourself. And it's like sometimes when I
Confirm your
hear
biases in the cornucopia of
exactly
shit that's out there.
when I hear somebody going like, "Do your own research," or "I did my own research," this is sort of like a red flag of like, "Uh-oh, I probably am not gonna trust anything that this person is about to say." But the funny thing is, like, I was out there also doing my own research some of the time, right? Like, I mean, I this is a deep problem, and I don't know if I'm gonna have a simple answer to it, but I you know understanding being educated about cognitive biases and logical fallacies was one step along the way, and I've definitely hit that multiple times in my life, and I that's been helpful. I think also trying to consider um the rationality community has like a variety of pieces of advice, little kind of techniques for you could even just imagine you had to like even if you just imagine you had to bet real money on the thing without even betting real money and ask yourself, would you bet the real money on this? Can actually correct
Yes.
your own bias. It's kind of a funny little mental trick you can kind of do. Now this is you can take this and apply it you, to yourself, but you asked me like, how do I do it with expertise? And one you can kind of apply these kind of techniques you could apply to your own biases or your own thoughts to the experts, but also I think sampling across different sources. When a big news thing happens, I'm like, well, obviously there's going to be hot takes across the political spectrum from all kinds of places, so let me examine them. Even sometimes I would try to predict, okay, oh, like I heard this breaking news. Let's say like I heard it on my New York Times feed. I'm like, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, I bet you Ben Shapiro has a take on this. And instead of like I'm like, let me think, what do I think his take would be? And then I go over and I listen to him like, oh, I was kind of right about this and kind of wrong about this. So doing little games of trying to kind of predict. And in a way, like it's not just me trying to be right about what Ben Shapiro would think about the thing. It's really that in and of itself as another data point. Like I'm trying to kind of triangulate on what I think is likely to be the case if I were to account for all of the takes. But it's a little tricky because it's like I'm trying to regard it, another way of putting this is a lot of what the news has become has not been what happened. A lot of what the news has become is like, what are people saying about what happened? Which is kind of weird, but like it is, I think, part of this kind of whatever you want to call it, the post-truth or postmodern condition. And you're kind of trying to have to, I think it's somehow journalistic norms sort of gave up on objectivity. I mean, maybe this had to do with what was the doctrine that I think Reagan got rid of in terms of
Yeah, the
broadcasting?
fairness
The
doctrine.
fairness doctrine. I think something happened after this where suddenly people were like, oh, cool, we'll just make news basically into takes now and let fucking people figure it out for themselves. So, in a way, I don't know if it's more honest in a way because it's not trying to present like a quasi objectivity, but in another way, it's like, wow, I guess I gotta kind of piece it together myself by looking at it from many multiple
Oh, and
angles.
God, and it's funny what you say that because we have this idea that in the era of the three networks, the two major papers, and the university system back
Yep.
in the 50s and 60s, apart from skepticism about authority, man, that the hippies had, and they were right to
Right.
be skeptical of that authority,
Yep.
but there was still this general consensus about the blue church. That is, that there was this hierarchy that had access to knowledge because of the relative laurels and expertise and all of this kind of stuff. And generally speaking, you referred to those experts and their studies, their peer-reviewed journals, their whatever they said as a talking head when they're invited on the news, and you sort of accepted it as a species of faith. And it's not like we were suddenly thrust into the postmodern condition by virtue of the internet.
Right.
It's that we were always in this condition, and we simply had faith in this apparatus of knowledge, where today we don't and can't, because it's been broken apart by the internet, essentially. And so it's like, we navigated the world in great measure based on faith in this stuff, and today we just can't find our moorings anymore. This hall of mirrors that is the um post-truth internet age is kind of like, gives us more at our disposal, and yet less in
Hmm.
terms of what to grab onto, because you're right, we're always going to confirm our biases. But I'll give you a quick example. The other day, I love examples of picking on people on social media, because I do it sometimes and I can't help myself. But there's
Yeah.
this very very smart but also very very partisan man named David Brin. He's a science fiction writer. He also wrote
Yeah.
a great little book called The Transparent Society. But
Totally.
he is such a partisan. And so the economic talking points of the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party, he he hews to that line pretty much verbatim. And so he was touting and praising the next round of spending from the Biden administration, which is purportedly to be an infrastructure bill,
Hmm.
right? And that this was going to accelerate the economy and do all these wonderful things, and um, compete with the Belt and Road Initiative, and also be a form of the Green New Deal. And he was just basically he's saying that, and used the word Keynes in the context of his post. So I said, all of this, I said something to the effect of all of this Keynesian helicopter money and special interest spending is just so much bullshit, essentially, was the bottom line.
Hmm.
And I didn't have time to unpack it and give any kind of Hayekian response, or comparative analysis. We know that when the government builds roads, those things have value, but you have to relativize it to all manner of other dimensions in the
Hmm.
economy,
Hmm.
right? But in the context of this comment, all of his fanboys and girls were just sort of jumping on me, saying, "You don't think that roads have value? How will we get around?" And all this. I was like, "No, that's not what I'm saying." It's like, we have
Right.
this unprecedented debt and debt spending. We've already gone through 3 rounds of stimulus spending. We are at 118% to 130% of GDP in our debt levels. And the idea that we're somehow going to spend our way out of that by stimulating the economy with this spending is essentially a bankrupt idea. But I couldn't fully explain that. And so what's interesting about it is he challenged me to a bet, but there was no
Uh-huh.
terms to the bet. It's like he was trying to pretend like he was part of the rationality community, which was so transparent in this regard. I said, I'll bet you any time, any day, and I'll debate you anytime, any day, because I will put my understanding of economics up against yours any day. But the thing is, what he was trying to do in playing like, or posturing as if he were part of the rationality community, is he didn't propose any terms of the debate. He didn't say what aspect we were going to, debate over or going to seek truth about. And I guarantee whatever he would have proposed, we would have found ourselves in this post-truth hall of mirrors, where we could, or into the cornucopia, where we had gone to our relative cornucopias and found everything we wanted to support our positions.
Yep.
And no one would have been able to actually win the bet. And
Yep.
the only way to do those bets is to behave like a Philip Tetlock.
Yep. There's a lot in what you said. And I appreciate you making it kind of a concrete example. Like these hot takes or social media debates, oftentimes these things are all interwoven, right? It's like our belief about like what's true about the world, or like facts from history or supposed facts from history, um, and what we think would be true in the future, right? Like our predictions, and especially our predictions that are contingent on policy decisions, right? Like, oh,
Right.
if we adopt this policy, then we'll probably get this result. And then somehow this evidence is trotted out of like, yeah, see, we adopted a policy like that and we got this other result. And there's some validity to that line of reasoning, but you're also saying like we can all kind of do this and we can kind of cherry pick our things. I mean, it's a little bit of what's super frustrating. I mean, even if you just take this kind of Keynesian versus Hayekian like economics debate, I mean, there is like the cornucopia of like, hey, look at this. See, this is why, it's a blended economy and the New Deal and FDR, and that was what we had to have. Otherwise, we wouldn't friggin' have the infrastructure we have now. And like, and
right.
then
And there's no counterfactual.
There's no counterfactual, right? Exactly. But
yeah. So like, what are you betting on, right? So we'd have to go back in time and do things the other way to see what the economic. Yeah, exactly. So when we try to debate on the past, we never have the counterfactual. We only actually have what happened, and you relativize it to an ideal.
Yep.
That's another problem.
Yep.
The great Thomas Sowell, the economist, has always said there are only trade-offs. There are no solutions. There are only trade-offs. Yep. It's meant to really that's a mimetic way, a heuristic way of thinking that is trying to teach people that there is no idealized policy that's going to bring about some pro-social result and have no unintended consequences.
Yeah.
So we always have to relativize first of all, what purported result do you think you're going to bring about, which almost never happens in policy. And then you have to make that relative to the costs and risk side of the equation, which is also exceedingly difficult in policy. So this is why people like Philip Tetlock and Robin Hanson are, and I think these are card-carrying members of the rationality community. I'm certainly always impressed by them. Another one is Brian Kaplan. They make these bets. They make these bets on probability. They're informed by theory. You can't all of your everything you're going to do in terms of prediction and forecast is going to be value laden. It's going to have some ideological assumptions embedded in it, whether you like it or not. Mm-hmm. But at least they temper that with some concept of the empirical. So the kind of claims that they make and the kind of bets that they make are always very restricted to some data set at a time slice.
Yep. I mean, this is, well, we really we sort of jumped into the deep end, it seems like to me. And I want to see we can
back it up if you want,
Yeah, no. I think teasing apart some of these things, is important, right? Because it's like, almost like even, as I listen to you, I'm like, right. Like, it's like there's almost this like magnetism or gravitational pull towards like, well, it's like the policy in the future and the past and our theories about what's true, they're interrelated. And like, we always want to kind of like relate them to each other. And like, I do think this is perhaps it's an insight of postmodernism, is this idea that like, that we can create like a perfect version of epistemic rationality, independent of all instrumental rationality, independent of all motivated reasoning. I think that's a deep philosophical question that we're not going to be able to answer here. I mean, there's definitely places where they converge. That's for sure. Right. But like, I think there are some ways we can try to tease them apart. Like, I mean, you're like, well, we don't have a counterfactual to like, what could have a parallel universe version of FDR done for the New Deal or whatever. And like, and does that count as valid evidence for choosing like a big giant infrastructure spend bill now, or doesn't it? But I do sometimes think we end up with kind of natural experiments. Sometimes there's a funny thing that you can test hypotheses by doing a thing called retrodiction, where you could be like, look, we've collected actually a data set from the past, and you can sort of test a theory by making a prediction about what you should see in that data set, based on like, and then you can actually it's kind of a funny way of doing it, but like, I think there's some validity in that. We're not always stuck with, there was only just one timeline and this is how it happened. I mean, in a certain sense, we kind of are, right? Like we don't have parallel, like you can imagine these alternative things, which we kind of do, in these like things like, the man in the high castle, right? Like, what if the Nazis had won, right? These kind of different worlds, we do in our sci-fi imagination, which is kind of fun, but I also, think that we can, like this is the whole idea. Like, why don't we set up an A/B split test of a thing, or why don't we create an experimental situation where we can iterate and reset the conditions and run it over and over again. And if you look at sort of like down stack science, if you look at physics, for example, like that is what we do, right? Like we create an experiment, we can run it hundreds, thousands of times, right? I remember like rolling the little steel ball down the ramp like in high school, and with my little stopwatch. Oh, you could just do this, and you do a little scatter plot and create a curve on a thing. See, we're like, this is Newton's law of whatever. You know what I mean? Like you can do that, but unfortunately, as you kind of ratchet up the stack towards more social sciences or decision making grounded in kind of like some kind of rationale, like a policy, hey, let's do this instead of that, and we're kind of trying to just base it off of historically what happened, we don't have a counterfactual. We
And the
can't rewind it and
context has
rerun it.
changed. It's a complex system. I
Yeah.
mean, the sheer scale and complexity of the US economy, to just to go back to that example,
Hmm.
today is light years away from what it was during the New Deal, for example.
Right.
And yet we have a popular national mythology, and yes, I'm making a truth claim about this, or a falsity claim actually. We all grew up with the idea that FDR got us out of the Great Depression,
Hmm.
right? With the New Deal.
Hmm.
And he's lionized in the social studies books. I mean, it's just I mean, in my view, it's just horseshit propaganda. Of course he put people to work, but they never talk about the cost side of the equation, and the fact that the unemployment rate persisted into well into World War II, um, and that when the company was the country was at full employment, it's only because all of the men were out to overseas and fighting in a war. I mean, there's just all kinds of just weirdness surrounding these questions, and you can go back and unpack them endlessly. The thing about making decisions though into the future in a situation of complexity is rather like have you ever heard there's an old, I guess you'd call it not an anecdote, but an allegory of the blind men and the elephant.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. And this is an allegory, for listeners. It's just like, imagine all of these blind men, let's say there are 10 or 15 blind men around the elephant, and none of them have ever seen an elephant before.
Hmm.
And they finally encounter one, and they're touching it, right? And one says, well, it's an elephant is hard, and rough. And, apparently this one is touching the tusk. And another
Hmm.
one says, oh, well, it's wrinkly and leathery. Another one's touching the knee, so they're trying to put together this, what you might call multifaceted truth totality through
Yeah.
limited epistemic means. And yet, as they communicate with each other, they get more and more of this. And so
Yes.
that's at least in some sense what you call weaving shared reality.
Yeah.
Um, it at least approaches that with both history, the hindsight of history, as well as making prediction and forecast, or judging a truth claim, a claim of fact in the news. You get this phenomenon of these fact checkers, which are absolutely hilarious in how postmodern this enterprise has become. It is just a fractal of fact checkers who are just in constant war with each other, and people literally hold the fact checkers up as these truth warriors.
Yeah.
And it's absolutely absurd. You can pick their shit apart left and right if you want to, because they're always biased, they're always partisan in both directions.
Hmm.
Um, and to be someone who is pretty nonpartisan as you and I would say are, uh, we try to divorce ourselves from partisan narratives and truth claims, and and instead operate with a view to skepticism about partisan claims, because we know that what's in it for the partisan is different from what's in it from us not being in that system or that tribe.
Yeah.
It is nevertheless, even if you try to reduce your bias by stepping outside of the partisan matrix for some truth claim,
Yeah.
it's nevertheless still a very, very difficult hall of mirrors.
Yep. Yeah. So, I think we're touching on a few things here that I like. One is, maybe this bears making really explicit, like this is how I treat the thing, I sort of have some view. Okay, the truth is out there. It's like Kant's like there's a noumenon somewhere over there, right? Like it's out
Mhm.
there, right? But I can't perceive it directly. So I'm sampling across multiple sources, and you know, even when I look at like I do go look at a fact checker. Oh, somebody made a claim over here. What does fucking Snopes say about that particular truth claim? But then I don't go like, and then Snopes is the noumenon, right? No, Snopes is just Snopes, right? Like it's like I'm trying to put together like a constellated kind
Somebody
of like
else
a
behind a computer,
yeah,
you
somebody
know.
else who's like fact checking a thing according to a certain fact checking methodology. And I'm like, okay, cool. I mean, and you can kind of go in and sort of like, what, how do fact checkers do their job? Oh, cool. You can go over here and do this online course about like how to do fact checking. And you can sort of like look at the techniques there. Okay, how much do I trust those particular style of techniques? And I think, in some really deep philosophical sense, I think Kant was right. We'll never perceive the noumenon directly. It's impossible. And we still got to do something like collective sense making. And I think to kind of go back to our early 20th century science stuff, I think it was super weird for scientists when, Einstein and the quantum dudes came up with the thing and they were like, wait a minute, we've just been relying on this Newton thing as though it was the way that it was. And then it was sort of like, well, how do we even make sense of that? And then Kuhn came along and said, well, this is this idea of like a paradigm shift. And actually, these models are just models, right? There's the Newton model, there's the Einstein model, there's a quantum model. And even these models, for all of the incredible amount of predictive measurement precision and all this kind of shit that they do, which is incredible. It's like some of the most rock solid knowledge we have about our physical world. Like, you're like, yeah, if you input the variables over here in a Newtonian model, you'll get a slightly different answer than the one if you put in the Einsteinian model. And you're like, but scientists don't even think of these models as like which one is the real one anymore, right? Like you kind of get into this is like philosophy of physics kind of stuff where
Yeah.
you're just like, look, we're just looking at it from different facets or points of view, and that's all we're ever going to be able to do. And we got to kind of just get over that and realize that the postmodernists are kind of right in a certain point of view when they say is what they call it, knowledge production or knowledge construction, this kind of thing. It's not totally relativistic, but there is something like what we think we know, even at the downstack levels of like hard sciences, is the product of a socially mediated process that
Right.
it also it flies a little bit in the face of this, like the Galileo story, or at least what I took away from this high school version of, the lone scientific hero, which is sometimes exactly what they were. Like Newton went off and fucking made up his shit kind of all on his by himself, which is kind of crazy. But nevertheless, like even Newton's stuff had to be sort of like put into this social process of, he was a little bit of a dick about it, right? People be like, huh, I wonder, blah, blah, blah. And Newton be like, I already have the answer. And he's like, boom. And everyone was like, shit, man, he was right. And like, but there was some version of like, and Newton didn't really become official until there was some amount of this consensus that was generated through a social process. And I'm pointing to this, I'm pointing to a couple different aspects of knowledge, but also kind of, I want to just assert there's an intrinsically social dimension to knowledge production we just will never be free of. It's
Escape.
actually part
Yeah.
of the process. What are your
Yes,
thoughts on that?
absolutely. The my two of my three of my favorite philosophers on this are W.V.O. Quine, Donald Davidson and Richard Rorty.
Mm-hmm.
All for different reasons. They have some similarities, some differences, but I think what they all share is this idea. Quine has this great saying: "The Humean predicament is the human predicament." Okay, which is to say, Hume was basically saying Humean skepticism, right?
Right.
He's in the Enlightenment. He's saying everything, and Kant tries to really wrestle with this later on, but he's basically saying, look, you can't stand outside of your own skin ever. It is the phenomenon. It is the phenomenal all the way down. Your noumena is something that you can never ever have access to. You
That's
are
right.
locked in your subjectivity, completely locked. And of course, the Quineans and the Donald Davidson types and so on come out and say, well, we can start playing language games, after Wittgenstein, right? We can start talking to each other, and there's this kind of regress problem, or at least this mutual solipsism in the idea of intersubjectivity. I am a subject. You and I are trying to weave shared reality right now in our conversation. And yet we're always going to be mediated by the fact that you're a subject and exist in your matrix of subjectivity. I exist in the matrix of my subjectivity. And the only shared aspect between us is through the conduit of language.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we can be solipsist all day long, and I could even say, how do I know that there's another mind there? Right? But that's a different
Right.
question. That's
Right.
a different epistemic question. What we're concerned about is the existence of tables and chairs and quarks and other scientific phenomena, especially in the social science, which get really, really vague and really difficult to unpack. And so I hope you'll permit me to steer us there in the form of a question.
Sure.
Because I think in the social sciences this is quite pronounced, and it's not to say that the hard sciences are immune, but when we set about doing social sciences, we have peer review, we have replication, we have all of these methodologies to say, hey, you have these methodologies that are purported to be based on the scientific method. You're gathering data, and right there, data gathering is a reduction of a phenomenon in nature that is highly complex to a single dimension represented by a number.
Yep.
That reduction right there, it makes a limitation that very few people want to talk about. The whole process of data gathering can be completely fraught. So
Yep.
then you have this, okay, now I'm making a scientific claim based on this data with this group of people. How different they are one to the next, how diverse they are could yield different answers in different contexts of the methodology applied. But here's our first approximation of this. This is what the study says. And it's published, and it's in a journal. And
Yep.
everybody goes, yay, all the journalists and the idiots out there, including me, go, science says XYZ. And of course, science isn't a person. Science is being the scientific enterprise in a specific domain of inquiry with a specific methodology on a specific question, is being stewarded by individual people who are working together in this enterprise.
Yep.
And all of them are locked in that Humean matrix of subjectivity.
Yeah. Well, whew, covered a lot of ground there. I love it, dude. I love our conversations, Max. So I love going towards the social sciences. This is exactly where we need to go for a number of reasons. One of which is, we in this, to the degree we're still in the modern era, or we're still in a kind of like a scientific framework in terms of how we think we know about the world, right? We want to to appeal to the studies. Like the science says this and the science says that. And right, like you're not going to see a politician or a social theorist or an activist appeal to, Newton versus Einstein to like talk about what policies we should be implementing. No, we're trying to make the argument in terms of something that's popping out of these softer sciences, whatever you want to call them, right? Like there's psychology and there's sociology and there's social psychology, which kind of tries to interconnect the two. And there's a whole bunch economics also. And like there's a sociology of economics and the economics of sociology. And it's like, we don't really have even a coherent freaking framework. We just have these certain analytic devices that we're applying. And then we're like, man, but it's like, this is not, we know enough to know that this is not doing anything even remotely as solid as like what Newton and Einstein are doing. Maybe we can never get there. Maybe there's actually some problem because we're trying to like, I don't know, study ourselves. We're trying to like put a microscope or a telescope back on ourselves and look at human behavior. And maybe there's something like I've thought about this, like what if there's like, you know, the quantum measurement problem, like the Schrodinger's cat, is it alive or is it dead? Or when you perceive it, it changes, right? This kind of idea.
Heisenberg. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what I think there's a Heisenberg principle, like of social science, right? Like
Totally.
like you cannot take a thing and instrument back onto society without changing it. Like this is the criticism of like cultural anthropology in a way. It's like you're going to put a person in there, you're going to have your little, you know, white man deep in the jungle, sort of like jotting down some notes and like, I'm observing this tribe in their natural state. You're like, no, you're not, because you're there, right? Like they're not in a natural state anymore because they know you're over there under your fucking tent writing notes about them. So they're changing how they're behaving because of your presence. And like, I mean, there's so many fundamental issues even before we get to crazy things like the replication crisis. But like this idea of, you know, this might sort of sound a little depressing or even nihilistic in how I'm describing it, but I'm just trying to point out some of like the fundamental things that are just to grapple with in these softer sciences. And even medicine is one of them that is like, it's almost a quintessential one, because it's like a doctor, you know, a medical doctor must intervene, right? That's what they're there for. They're there to like do something, right? Like, but if you're in the operating room or you're in the emergency room or you're in whatever, you're like, look, I don't have time. This person is going to die. We don't have time to like prove with like medical science what the fucking cause is right here. Fundamentally, I got to make a call because the person's bleeding out, right? Like, and in that situation of the doctor kind of expanded outwards. Like all of medical research is kind of in this state that sort of straddles between, you know, fact and policy, right? And like this is why we have so many weird medical catastrophes or iatrogenic interventions that like, you know, cause more harm than they did good, or why we get, you know, like who's that Greek dude who Ionides, they kind of published that very famous like why most or half of all medical research is false. You know what I mean? Like this was like
yeah, I know exactly who you're talking about. He's been really good on the COVID stats too.
Yeah.
I would consider him to be one what Philip Tetlock calls a fox.
Mm-hmm.
He's very good at very careful, or Julia Galef's scout mentality. Mindset, right?
Yep.
Which is basically, you know, saying, let's wait and see. Let's gather more data points, more evidence to establish with humility a set of probabilities that balance against each other.
Yeah.
And don't rush it. Of course, as you say, in a hospital room, in a surgical theater, sometimes you have to just make a judgment call.
Right.
But hopefully that judgment call is informed by years of medical science and all of the good stuff that goes into what we think of as pretty solid foundations, multiple surgeries, outcomes of those surgeries, but also we hope in medical science journals having methodologies that limn or yield some sort of accurate picture of reality in the human body. But this is the other thing about human bodies versus human minds. When you go to psychology and you're talking literally about the way you're talking, there's some substratum there, which is that substratum is the human brain and the way the neurons fire and all of this kind of stuff.
Yep.
So there is a physicalist substrate there that we want to acknowledge, but it is not everything. Not everything is reducible to it. At least not in a way where we wouldn't want to send someone who needs therapy to a neuroscientist.
Exactly.
We
Exactly.
have to deal with patterns at certain levels of description on their own levels of description. And yet, the interplay between those levels of description can be extremely problematic in our understanding. We can get quacks who don't respect the physical substrate, and we can get physicalists who don't respect the therapeutic approaches. And
Yes.
that those two disciplines talking to each other is, as people specialize, you can sometimes get less of that, and that's not good.
Right. Yep.
So the problem of like the replication crisis, that kind of problem is more than a methodological problem. It is also a philosophical problem.
It is.
And I think, the way science gets funded, and the desire to want to have certainty and always have certainty, that there be some monolith that extends up to the sky and has truth inscribed in it, and we can all just go look at that monolith and its inscriptions to find truth, is wrongheaded. We don't live in that world anymore. It's gone.
We never did, really. We just sort of believed in the myth that we did.
Exactly. We improved on our religion.
Yeah, it's an artifact of modernity in a way. I mean, it is. If we are saying that, like, we're past modernism and into postmodernism, and then maybe we're going into something else like integral or metamodernism, we have to account for this thing, right? Like, even that myth, that modernist myth that we've kind of like, there are these fundamental facts of the matter, or the laws of physics are like really there in a concrete way, and they're not just models, right? But I want to jump to a slightly different thing real quick with you, because I think this kind of goes way over to, like, what I do for a living, and it's really kind of fun. Like, and this is intersubjectivity and relational practice and communication, because this is my sweet spot. I love talking about this, and we'll circle back to like facts and truth and journalism and science in a minute. But let's go over to like just even the domain of intimate relationships. This is a kind of a funny one, but if you think about it, it's like, what's your relationship status, right? You've got a girlfriend, you've got a
Yeah,
woman you live with.
that's right.
Right? You guys just had a baby together, and if I were to think by like, how do I come to know what is the relationship status of Max and his partner, right? I wouldn't pull out a microscope or a ruler or any kind of measuring device and go to anywhere in physical reality to try to measure that. What I would do is I'd say, hey, Max, are you in a partnership, a romantic partnership? And you would say yes. And then I would go over to her and I'd say, hey, are you in a romantic partnership with Max? And she'd be like, yes. And then I'd be like, cool. Therefore, they are in a romantic partnership together, right? That is the fact of the matter. It's built out of essentially your utterances about the state of some social condition between the two of you. And that's all that it is, right? When the minister says, I now pronounce you man and wife, or husband and wife, or whatever they say, that speech act is what creates it. Do you know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah,
that
it's a socially constructed reality.
And it only exists in a sense in the social construction of it. Like, it's a little bit different than saying, science about like, molecules and atoms. It's not like the science of molecules and atoms is built strictly out of utterances, right? It's mediated through our utterances, but there's a whole dimension of our world that's just purely intersubjective, right? Almost entirely. It is built out of our utterances. That's kind of it. And the weaving shared reality process, if you look at it in the domain where, I kind of worked with creators of like, authentic relating, and now it's in my meta relating practices, is it's relational, right? It's a bit of us trying to come to an understanding, or trying to essentially fill in our minds in a sense where we are confirming that we have a mutual understanding about one of these, you might say, non-physical things, these kind of like the status of a social thing. And, I know that, if I said, oh no, I'm totally with her and we're totally together. And you went and talked to her and she was like, I don't know what he's talking about. We are totally not together. What would you think of me, Max, if I said that? And she's like, no, we're not together. I'm like, no, we're totally together. She's like, no, we're not together. What would you think of me?
Oh, I would think that you were delusional or something.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
And I was saying, no, it's a fact. It's objective. You would be like, what are you talking about, Porch? The status of a relationship is not an objective fact. It's an intersubjective fact, basically, or an intersubjective thing.
We can imagine this is, I love, I don't want to get into the Gettier problem, but that's another one for another episode. We got to get into that sometime.
Sure.
But I do like the idea that maybe, okay, let's say you're in a relationship with someone and no, let's not do that, because I don't want you to have to imagine someone cheating on you. Let's say in an interpersonal relationship, there's a couple and they are together. They've agreed to be in the relationship and both leave for work that morning and say, that they're together, and they acknowledge that. Someone asks them that morning and they agree, yes, they're in a relationship and they have been for 2 years or whatever. Now, after the guy goes to work, this really beautiful woman comes up to him at work and says, "Are you in a relationship?" And he says, "No." She has every reason to believe what he's saying, but he's motivated by the possibility that maybe she's hitting on him because she's attractive, right?
Yeah.
And he's going to be a cheater. And so, if, let's say for some reason she comes into the office and someone says, "Oh, that's his girlfriend," and she goes up to the girlfriend and says, "Hey, are you two in a relationship? Are you in a relationship with that guy over there?" And she says, "Yes." Then she has gotten more data,
right,
and is probably of the either surmises that they're going through a time of uncertainty, or that he's a liar and a cheater. And probabilistically speaking, she would probably be right. And the more data points she's able to gather, the more she's able to sketch out that particular elephant in her mind.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah.
Yep.
So now but in relational practices just between two people, there are times when people argue and have disputes. And this is just two people. We're not talking about mass scale society. We're only talking about two people who can't agree about something very simple, who perceived an event in the past, for example, about which they're fighting in two very different ways. And it's almost like that they're through a healthy process of meta relating, are trying to arrive at the truth about what went wrong rather than the truth in question.
Yes.
Is that fair?
Yeah. When we're weaving. Yeah, no, totally. If we keep it strictly on the interpersonal level, I mean, this is great. And it's going to go into the social dimension really quick, like in the aggregate collective dimension. But if it's just you and me, right? Like, oh, that was weird. What happened there? And then I'm like, if I enact a certain protocol, right? I could do one protocol, which is just like, this is like gaslighting you. No, Max, you're wrong. This is what happened. And you're like, but I think this happened, Porch. And I'm like, no, Max, you're wrong. This is what happened. And I just get louder or whatever. I say more words, and and eventually you might be like, okay, I think you're right. Like that's a certain kind of protocol. Some people use this, right? Some people, it's a little bit of a power over, kind of a dominance strategy to kind of like
Yeah.
assert power about what's the truth about what's happened between the two of us. And, there's trade-offs. I don't want to behave that way with people that I respect, but like, I mean, you can, I suppose, if you don't care about respecting them,
And there's a
right? Like,
submission instinct there in a
yes,
lot of
yes.
people.
Yeah.
I don't have that gene, by the way.
No, you don't.
But a lot of people do. And by the way, my baby mama does not have that gene either. And so frequently in our interactions, we dig in our heels, and applying meta relating practices of the sort that you have shared with me as my friend has been really beneficial in our
Yeah.
relationship, because we are, look, and I'm not saying that it's healthy for a relationship to have one person have a submission instinct either,
No.
or a dominance instinct. What I'm
Right.
saying is that whether you have that instinct or not, meta relating is just going to rise above that.
Yes, I agree. And I think this is, I'm here just really promoting a certain, you might say it's a discourse ethic when it comes to relational communication. And that's what meta relating basically is fundamentally. But like to kind of get into it, like, I think there's a way that even in our organizational life, this idea of feedback, it has become sort of really corroded, right? It's almost like the manager goes like, I'm going to give you feedback, which means, well, I'm going to tell you about what that was like for me so that you know. And now you're supposed to just account for it that way. Or maybe you kind of have in your more enlightened organizations, like, the bosses, the people in power, they're supposed to welcome and embrace all the feedback. And then people kind of go like, hey, bosses, I have a feedback for you. And then the boss is supposed to be like, yes, validate the feedback, like a unidirectional thing. I'm like saying, no, this is broken. Weaving shared reality is like, hey, I want to share with you, this is what I observed. This is what I was intending. This is what I said and did. This is what you said and did that I perceived. This is what I made that mean. And and this is how I felt about it. I don't want to and I want you to know that. But then I also am saying, hey, dude, what was happening for you? What were you thinking? What were you making that mean? And then you share that. And now what we've done is in our discourse, we've kind of put some of our subjectivity into the intersubjective space. And now we can kind of compare and contrast, right? It's actually, this is what a good couples counselor will do and help you do if you suck at doing this with your partner. They'll be like, okay, so like now, do you think, do I really think that like my version of events is just like, no, that's what happened, and now I'm just going to go correct their mistakes? Or vice versa? No, actually what's going to happen is like, oh, shoot, I didn't really realize that when I said or did this, you made it mean that. But now I'm updating my own map of what happened. But you can do that too. And if we're both kind of bought into this style of discourse of weaving shared reality, we may never get to like total agreement, but maybe we will. And that's often, if there is a possibility of like near total agreement, this procedure gets you there, right? Like, but if it also is likely for you to just uncover and create more of that shared reality, which is really that social reality we're talking about, right? Like there's no measurement device. There's no place you go out there and like look at it, objectively speaking, right? It's created. It's not just observed. It's created through the discourse. Like we're creating what we now both believe did happen or transpire between the two of us, what our misunderstanding was and what the nature of that misunderstanding was. And that's social reality. It's a part of social reality.
And it's not to say that it's not hard, but it is a process. At least it's a set of protocols. You not only don't deny the emotional and values baggage that goes into it, you're required to import it and to inquire and invite the other person to do the same.
Yes.
Now, there are a lot of and this is not, I'm not trying to make the claim that this should scale to society, because it can't for various reasons.
Right.
But what about a localized meta relating practice, the kind that you are paid handsomely to help within companies?
Yeah.
What can you take from that framework to improve collective intelligence at scale?
This is exactly where I want to get to. So, I mean, I think there's what I'm thinking of right now is there's two ways. Like one way is, in a way, you can sort of treat weaving shared reality a bit like doing science in the intersubjective realm, where we're trying to uncover like what happened, right? Like what happened, right? Let's figure this out. Let's get clearer. And like if we do that, we actually enable our, our relationship to be more functional. And I think if you can have, I think some of the people who are trying to do like you know, what do they call, like transpartisan dialogue, like like the Better Angels people, or some of these other people that are trying to kind of convene spaces where, hey, we can come with real differences of opinion and have a discourse where we really understand the detailed nature, or some of the rationality kind of conversational protocols, like the idea of the double crux, like, or like, let me steel man your position, you steal my
Yeah,
man,
steel
steel man
manning. Yeah.
yeah, and now we can discover, oh, what is the crux of our actual disagreement? Oh, it's because like there's some, so there's like a network of beliefs, and we actually first sort of discovered, oh, the key thing that if it flipped one way, we would agree, or if we flipped the other way, we would agree. Like I think these techniques, when we're talking about more objective things, like are similar to weaving shared reality. So I think that's one thing. Hey, what happened? Like, can we figure out what happened and get on the same page about that? But I think also there's another the other side of it is this this kind of touches into interesting things like the nature of money and cryptocurrency, right? Like what the fuck is money anyway? Well, it's basically the cryptocurrency has value because we all say that it has value. Period. Like that's what fiat is, right? Like and in a way, some of these, societal constructs exist because we believe that they exist, right?
Yeah.
We like to say, like, like this person, we call that a murder when we get a conviction of murder out of a jury, and then we say, yes, that person murdered that person. Now you might believe that they murdered them, but it's almost like we're updating a social fact that they murdered them, and like
Yes.
that is an output of, hey, there was a judge, and there was a defense, and there was a prosecution, and they made their arguments, and this jury went off, and then they came back, and then when they came back, they said this is the verdict, and then now society says, yes, the defendant did commit murder, or the defendant did not commit murder, right? Like, and that social fact is, we just sort of say, like, is the output of that protocol. That social protocol creates that social fact. And I think this is another way to think about this, is the discourse norms, or you might say the protocol for the exchange of communication, whatever it might be, whether you're doing kind of good couples counseling or good meta relating or something else. Like, it doesn't just uncover social facts, it can create social facts that we cohere our behavior around, right? These are coordination artifacts in our intersubjectivity.
Yeah. Yeah. And yet part of the problem with the postmodern condition is we know that some social facts are better than others. The postmoderns would deny that. The metamodern is going to say, no, there's something to this. Not sure why. Let me give you an example. Let me give you a couple of examples, because realizing all the while that from a philosophical perspective that this is problematic, but intuitively we know that there's some, we know that there's something there. Maybe at least I can persuade you of this. Okay.
Let's see. Yeah.
All right. So first of all, there's a whole set of questions about the moral political idea of proportionality to some event. Okay. We have in society, we have a phenomenon that I think I mentioned it on another podcast, that Cass Sunstein and Timur Kuran came up with, called an availability heuristic, or availability cascade. And that is something bad happens in the media. Something bad happens. The media shines a light on it as an individual phenomenon that gets shared through the memosphere, and along with a narrative. Okay.
Yep.
Okay. We just saw the trial at this point in time of Derek Chauvin. He was guilty on all counts of murdering this man, George Floyd. And George Floyd, and the story of George Floyd, and this happened all on camera, so from multiple angles. So we got all kinds of video of this horrific crime. And I'm I'm of the mind that yeah, that these crimes were committed. I don't know if um, of the details of the law in the state of Minnesota, but generally speaking, I think it's dead to rights guilty, right?
Me too.
Um, and and yet, when George Floyd happened, there
Hmm.
was this mass movement, okay, where people are rioting in the streets in multiple cities. So it's not just rioting in this one city; it's rioting
Right.
in all the major cities. And the narrative has gone from here is an instance of police brutality to a narrative of uh this is this is not just an instance of police brutality, but a single instance of a wider racist white supremacist br- police brutality epidemic that is completely um that is all over the country. So here we have virtually unfalsifiable claim, okay?
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you actually dig into the data on the crime statistics, we have, of course, as I mentioned earlier, to be very skeptical of how those data are gathered and by whom they're gathered, because the data gatherers are also the people who are going to be evaluated on that data, namely the police. So that's problematic,
Yep.
and it's going to be imperfect. But there are certain aspects that are inescapable in those data. Okay. So you can
Hmm.
give it some wiggle room, but you can't give it too much wiggle room. And so when you get into the crime statistics on police brutality, you see it's pretty easy statistically to realize that there is not racist a racist white conspiracy on the part of police or unconscious bias or any other vague or vacuous claim you want to make
Yeah.
that would bring about this level or disproportional response to the event.
Yeah.
Okay. So if I were to be a fox, I would go and I'd say, okay, let's look at the data. What did the
Yep.
data show? What is what interracial violence? What does that look like?
Hmm.
Right. And this is, people are going to say, oh, well, you can't, how can you talk about races? It's like, well, this is what we have, right? People self-identify as black, white, this or that, person of color, whatever. Generally speaking, we have these racial categories that are indeed problematic.
Yep.
But at the end of the day, there is no universe in which you assert a fact. People are asserting through brute force of creating a socially constructed reality that America is irredeemably racist, that all problems terminate in white supremacy,
Yeah.
right? It's just like the unfalsifiable claims of the Marxists in the 20th century, right? Which is that there will eventually be a dictatorship of the proletariat, and they're being exploited by the capitalist class and all this other stuff. When it never happened, they said it was false consciousness. Same thing. It's the same kind patterns of not thinking, but just claims without any evidence. And
Yeah.
evidentiary tools of reason, and tools of good discourse, including those logical fallacies that you mentioned
Hmm.
at the beginning of the show, are all missing and are taken out by the postmodern / critical theorists
Yes.
in this day and age. And it has allowed them to create a social reality that is inferior to that noumenon we know is there, which is that there is
Yes.
some racism, it's isolated, and this, that, and the
Yeah.
other. But the response can't be proportional.
Yes.
It misses this whole other areas of inquiry on policy for policing. Um, it misses a whole bunch of people who are being victimized by police who are of different races than
Yep.
black. And so it's essentially created this master narrative that is what you might call a statistical falsehood. It is an
Yep.
intersubjective agreement that millions and millions of people have that is in some sense false. But how to describe that falsehood is difficult.
Dude, this is we're in a right smack in a hot topic, and maybe even a contentious topic, maybe even contentious between you and me. Let's see.
Okay.
But I want to use this particular example to tease apart a few things. One is this idea that there's almost like a social fact, or one of these quasi social facts that is being generated by essentially like a mass feedback loop of rhetoric, right? Of like,
Yes. The availability.
Derek Chauvin committed
cascade.
murder. Derek Chauvin committed murder, right? And it was caused by systemic racism. It caused by systemic racism. It's like, well, if enough people repeat that enough times, it becomes true because enough people believe that it's true. And then you're sort of saying yes, but that's leaving out this other stuff where it's like, we actually do have social science studies about criminology, and we have some statistics over here about what these relative frequencies are, and we should also be including that, right? And it's like there's these almost these two different styles of discourse that are kind of happening.
Yes.
And what I want to do is point a couple things out. One is, well, it sort of depends on achieving some shared reality about the discourse norms themselves, right? Like,
oh yes,
which to me is, my favorite theorist on this is Jürgen Habermas, who's, I can't believe he's still alive. He's just like the most ancient dude. And he goes all the way back to the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, but he himself was not, he was a defender of the Enlightenment. He actually took on the postmodernists in the 80s. But his idea here of like communicative rationality, I think, is really appropriate, because he's basically saying like our ability to have a free society, our ability to continue the Enlightenment project, like actually depends on something like we have shared reality about what the proper discourse ethics are, like the norms that govern the way that we communicate. So this is sort of saying like, if we kind of go to this example, which version counts better, right? Does this kind of like sober social science statistics count?
Speaking the language of whiteness right now.
Maybe I am. I mean,
I'm kidding. I'm kidding, but I'm not. I mean, this is exactly what the poet Audre Lorde said. She said, if these are the tools that built the master's house.
Yep.
The master being whitey. Okay. The white power, white patriarchy. You cannot employ in rebuilding the new, more utopian, whatever it is. You can't employ the tools of the master. You can't use the tools in the master's house. And what that is saying is that rationality, reason, discourse norms,
empiricism,
evidence, statistics, all of these means of trying to weave shared reality, that these are taken off the table and replaced with power and political power assertions. This is the problematic aspect of how you're not even weaving shared reality. You're just what are you doing in the case where you just
let me tease this, like there's a little I don't want to accuse you of bad faith, but there's a certain bias in your interpretation of this particular one. But let's just give it its due. But I actually kind of want to get to something I think is a little more
it's racial bias too.
Sure. You're a white guy.
I'm Southern. I'm white.
Yeah,
and I'm on the defensive.
You can't escape. You're on the defensive. Yeah. But this is a little bit analogous, right? It's like the couple has a fight, and the one person in the couple goes like, "Nuh-uh, this is what happened," and you're like, "But I don't think so." And I'm like, "No, this is what," right? Like that style of like, yeah, well, statistics is just white supremacy. Yeah, empiricism is white supremacy. Rationality is white supremacy. Like all those studies, white supremacy, right? It's like, we're just going to say this louder and over and over and over. But guess what? That actually is, if I were to kind of give it its due to a certain degree, I would say like that's a style of discourse that's creating a certain kind of shared reality based on those kind of norms. I don't think Habermas would like those. I don't think I would like those. I know George Orwell wouldn't like those either, right? Like this is the style of creating shared reality, which is just like fucking just beat people over with like what like thought reform you need to have to get them to all at least agree enough that we're like, okay, this is okay. This is we're in this reality where this is the way that it is, right? It's a tool of authoritarians. It's a tool of sociopathic abusers. Let's just put that aside for a second. I actually want to get to something that is more interesting to me, which is let's I think there are good faith arguments on this side, and some of this actually has to do with some of the stuff that we were talking about earlier, which is methodological issues in the social sciences. You talked about like how do you even measure a thing, right? You alluded to this idea. Well, like if you actually go into social science methodology, there's encoding, right? It's like, well, how do we code for that? It's like, well, if the if you're looking at the transcript of the interviewer and they say of the interview and they say something like this, you code it in this way, right? It's like this kind of reductionism, right? You're turning something sort of soft and squishy into like a quasi objective measurement because like
Exactly.
what else are we fucking doing, right? And like we go over here to criminological statistics and like
Same problems.
I think it's a mistake to treat the entire edifice. We can go in there and go like, but look, the initiation of things doesn't have a difference along racial lines here or there, the way that the whatever the woke mob wants to say that it does. But the I think the I'm just imagining somebody on the socially progressive side that still embraces something like a liberal progressivism. I would simply say like, look, criminology statistics are actually suffering some methodological bias in terms of A, which studies are even being done, B, how those studies are choosing to encode certain things. It's almost like saying, hey, there's a bunch of sociological dark matter in there that if you really love all of your statistical empiricism methodology, you should go and like point the microscope at it. And I'm willing to take a bet that if you did, you would actually start uncovering some shit that is currently not revealed by studies as they exist. Now, that's a claim, right? And if we were doing some kind of prediction market here, I would be willing to bet. Like, I think, for example, vagrancy laws are like vaguely defined enough that they could just be fucking selectively enforced, and you kind of get this thing. So yeah, I do think there's probably some racial biasing in terms of how vagrancy laws are enforced. Maybe there's already statistics about that. Maybe there's not. But like this idea that the Sam Harrises of the world like to kind of, hey, we're getting into this criminological. Well, let's actually examine where we do have data, where we have pointed the flashlight. Do we uncover the racial biases in the statistics that we currently have? And if the answer is kind of no, I don't think we just go like, see, right? I actually think we could think you got to actually do that kind of like good rationality, which is like outside view. Well, what is currently not being studied, or are those studies replicable, or what's the methodology by which those things are being encoded? That's those
Sure.
kinds of
And
things.
and we started the show by pointing out all of these things, and you can't be super biased in your selection of which ones are tainted and which ones are not. So,
Sure.
and if you're pointing that at me, that's absolutely right. And I acknowledge that. I
Yep.
acknowledge that I am skeptical of I'm skeptical of statistics. I'm skeptical of data sets. I'm
Yep.
skeptical of data collection and methodology. And yet I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater because I
Yep.
know that we all, in some sense, have to rely on these for uh, weaving collective shared reality. Um,
Yes.
so of course I want to see those improved. Now, there are some things in there that are very hard to fudge or to misinterpret or to have methodological breakdown, like
Yep.
counting dead bodies,
Exactly.
people who have been murdered. You
Yeah.
know, if somebody's lying on the ground and they died of a heart attack 2 seconds before they were hit by a bullet, yes, we might miss them in the death statistics, in the murder rate or
But
whatever.
but even there, cause of death encoding is fucking done by the examiner, and like even you're like counting bodies murdered, and I'm like those are not the same, right? There's like a body that's dead. That body is dead.
Yeah, but when
If
the
it's
difference,
murder, that's actually a legal ruling. That the right, it's kind
right?
of like death by bullet wound is exactly what you're going to get encoded at that layer, right?
Oh, it's the same way that people try to say that the United States has a lower birth rate. That the birth rate, I'm sorry, the infant mortality rate is higher in the United States than in other places. Because they count stillbirths and live births differently in different countries. It's a coding error.
Yes.
And
Or
and
difference.
and God, I mean, the way people die, the manner of death, and the sort of the imprimatur of justice on those uh events is, as you say, really difficult. And yet there we have to also acknowledge that, look, there's enough there that, even if, I mean, like, there's some wiggle room in this stuff, but there can't be so much that it is utterly contrived. Or, I mean, like, it is a mitigating factor to consider crime data in all of this stuff in order to form some sort of proportional response. So I'm not saying that those data are perfect. In fact, we started the show by saying these kind of, these kind of soft sciences are deeply problematic. And
Yes.
it's like and there's inherent vagueness. When is someone bald?
Right. Versus
Right?
balding.
Are they, they're balding, but when are they bald? Is that like the 277th hair or 278th hair, that they actually
Yeah.
get to be bald? A lot of times the world has this kind of vagueness, and we're just doing line
Yes.
drawing activity around
Over
our epistemology.
Totally. I mean, especially when you're talking about the soft and squishy world of social fact. And this is where I want to, there's some part of me that just wants to really hit this. We haven't like nailed this for the listener of just how fucking crazy this is. I don't, please do not fall into a pit of despair, but you should at least be peering over the edge into despair. Not only is the issue of just like, oh, we don't choose the same encoding, or the stats don't necessarily cover all the things, or we can't replicate the things. Not only that, social facts are generated. Like, are we in a committed relationship together? Yes, we are. Yes, we are. That's what makes it true. And this is what's sort of weird about like policy choices, right? In a way, it's not just like, the policy is the cause and the effect is the sociometrics we measured later. There's a causative thing, right? Like, that's being created by the fucking narrative. Like, if enough people are buying into the narrative, here's one that you poke at in your books and stuff, is like this idea that like elections are a way of aggregating the will of the people,
Yeah,
and preferences. That's a story that is one that, like,
it is a social fact that is totally and utterly wrong.
But it's the social fact that we have all fucking bought into.
Most people,
not
so
everybody,
many
but
people,
enough people.
Yes,
So many people. It's a transpartisan buy-in we have of that.
Yeah. And I think,
Yeah.
and just not to put too fine a point on it, I think democracy is a big old shit show spectacle. I use the term, you cry your teardrop in the ocean and expect the tide to turn. That is what your vote means. And we have this idea that if, like, we have hundreds of millions of people on one side and hundreds of millions of people on the other, and just because there's a little bit more on this side, that somehow this is how we establish another social fact on top of this already fraught and problematic social fact of elections. It's like, this is just the way we do things, man. It's
right.
It's like my Jewish baby mama is always talking about, like having Christmas break. It's just like, Christmas is just a social fact that comes around each year, and it just kind of plops itself into our lives, and we hear the fucking Christmas music all the time. And she's like, I'm a Jew, like I don't care about this. And in fact, it can irritate her, and I can see why. I mean, hell, certain amount of Christmas music irritates me too. And I'm just a non-believer. But I also like Christmas, certain things about Christmas, and she will admit to liking it too. But it is still a social fact. It's almost inescapable, even if it's been ripped of a lot of its religious dimension and remains this sort of secular social fact. It rolls around every year. It's an unstoppable force in
Right.
America.
Yeah. It has causal power in
Oh,
our
yeah.
physical world. This fucking social fact. Like these social facts have gravity. We've talked a little bit about this in, I think, in our very first episode where we talked about social reality and social evolution, is like social facts themselves, even if they're non-physical, can have causal force in the physical world. Like Christmas is a really great example, or elections is another one. But I want to weave in something you said, I think we were preparing for this talk, that could be related to this. You said there's a difference in the collective intelligence of the sense, in the sense that, like, was that famous book, was it I Pencil or something like this? Who wrote that one?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like there's nobody, or
Leonard
the toaster
Reed.
idea, Leonard Reed. Okay. This idea that there is no person who understands how to make a pencil, right? And there probably never will be. And yet a pencil is a fairly simple artifact that we all are very familiar with. And we've created trillions of pencils, over the history of the pencil. And somehow our social and economic processes take this knowledge that has been kind of smeared about and aggregates it into
An object
an
that you can use.
Right? And we don't have shared reality in the way that I use that term. Like, hey, what happened there? Oh, this is what happened here, and this is how I did it, and this is how you did it, and this is how I did. Okay, cool. And it's not like we created a giant conference room where we took the miners and the wood people and the lumberjacks and everybody and like
had them talk to each other. Like we don't
have them talk to each other.
We don't go to pencil church on Sunday.
Right. We understand how the pencil happens, right? We don't have to do that. We can actually like let it kind of be partially aggregated, but there is some.
They're like fragments of a truth totality.
Yeah.
The fragments are themselves truths, right?
Yeah.
Like how to extract the rubber from the rubber plant, or mining graphite. These are all very specific activities that involve a whole lot of people, and they have very highly specialized ways of dealing with these resources that go into making the pencil. Mm-hmm. But each of those shards has its own truth value. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to construct the pencil at all. It would fail.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Now I want to see what you think of this. I'm going to try to weave together a few things here. And like, feels like a bit of a novel kind of synthesis, even as I'm saying it. Like, we've also talked about, like the election thing. Like, even if we have like grossly different ideas, on Team Red versus Team Blue, most of the people on Team Red and Team Blue share this underlying, like this underlying mythos of the liberal representative democracy. We all buy that thing. This procedure that we're doing is somehow aggregating our beliefs.
Well, so they all do, not we, because I'm not in that.
Sure. Sure. You're not in that.
And that's and I'm sure, and I've made a bit of a cottage industry out of being a skeptic in that regard. But when you say we in terms of some amorphous American collective that creates a social fact, abso-fucking-lutely. It is unstoppable.
Right. Yeah, totally. So what I want to say, let's go to the pencil thing now, is that even if there's a lot of specialized knowledge in all the little components of the kind of, supply chains and the manufacturing process of the pencil, that like no human brain, not even any single organization has it in aggregate, that there's some social layer that we're all plugged into. The layer of money, pricing, private contracts, something like this, which we kind of do have some shared reality about. Maybe if you start talking about like international trade, there's a little bit of a difference there, but like, let's just say, you could create a certain pencil, like 100% built in the USA, just as a kind of fictitious example. Well, guess what? Well, in the USA, for the most part, I mean, I suppose we have state-to-state differences, so maybe it's a bad example, but at the very least, all the participants who have all the specialized engineering knowledge of how to build the pencil all have a shared reality knowledge of, hey, how do we negotiate the buying and selling of the goods and the services, and we all kind of have some shared reality understanding of if there was a breakdown in our agreement, we would recourse to tort law or something like this, a civil court or something like that, common law idea. So I'm saying is like there's for the manufacturing of the thing, even if the collective knowledge of how to do that thing never really exists in any shared reality, it actually sort of requires a kind of a shared reality at, you might say, a protocol layer or a procedural layer that we're all sort of plugged into in order to do the thing. What do you think of this idea?
I think it's a really fruitful direction or avenue, particularly as we've already talked about how these protocol layers. The way I try to think of it in the book is, what are the protocol layers that are going to give people skin in the game, right? Because
Yes.
when I say people construct false realities, most of the time, whether it's QAnon or just anti-racism narratives or whatever, all of these
Flat Earth
stuff. I mean, there's that there is very little cost, if any, to being wrong, and in fact, there's often a reward for being wrong. If you can't pair the reward of being right, if you can't pair the reward with being right, as in tracking truth, then you're going to have an extremely, in the words of Schmachtenberger, polluted information ecosystem. Right. Because people are being rewarded for their wrongness.
Right.
Okay. And yet, so I've been asking myself, what is the protocol layer? I try in the book to point to something that would resemble a prediction market. And prediction markets have very, very limited scope in what they're actually able to do. Okay. Especially, first of all, they're predicting there's something that hasn't happened in the future. There has to be, but the protocol layer you're talking about with prediction markets is we have to agree to some data set that is a measurement at some point in time T, that data set is going to have a measurable quantum. Okay. Quantity rather. And
you have to be able to formulate your bet in a precisely measurable way.
Right.
You have to articulate it in that way.
And that
for it to be a meaningful
that
bet.
is a layer. That is a layer of the stack. Right.
That's right.
When you're talking about, let's imagine something like a market in perceptions, because each of us has a perception. This is the subjective idea, the subjectivity idea. This is my lived experience. Okay. Your lived experience ain't shit. Okay. Until you have skin in the game is what I'm trying to argue. But I can't figure out how to put skin in the game. And let me give you an example. Let's say we wanted to I wanted to introduce a truth claim, some sort of claim that relies on data for its answer. Okay. That claim in this case is asking people shelter at home orders during a pandemic will result in significantly lower death rates and mitigation of the spreading of the pandemic virus. Okay. But that is the claim. And then we have to have some measurement of what significant is. Some either percentage measurement or something. Okay.
It's a bit like a design of an experiment thing in the scientific method.
Yeah. Yeah. It's got to have all of these. It's got to have this meta framework that we can agree to even to make the bet.
Right. That's a procedural protocol thing, right? The design of experiment.
Exactly.
What makes it valid. Methodological sort of way of assessing.
So in this imaginary market where I place this and I say, okay, I think lockdowns essentially help with slowing disease and reducing deaths. Overall, the time window being, let's say, 2 years. Okay.
Yep.
At some point in time T in the future, it either does or doesn't do that. Okay.
Right.
If you start looking at the data sets now, it's starting to look like lockdowns did absolutely nothing for the spread of the virus. You can do interstate comparisons, intercountry comparisons, and it doesn't look like lockdowns did much of anything. And in fact, they usually just, if anything, it would, you would have to have perpetual lockdowns for the entire time, maybe for it to work. And nobody's talking about testing those because that would be an absolute catastrophe on other factors of life, other patterns of behavior, like the economic patterns of behavior, social patterns, and so on. So just getting correct all of the inputs to this are going to be are really difficult. And then after you've done that, you want to introduce mechanisms, evidentiary mechanisms. But each of these evidentiary mechanisms is its own truth claim that also has to be evaluated in the same manner. So what you get is a perceptions fractal.
Yeah.
And no one can stand outside his or her reference frame to ever validate it. There is no umpire for this shit. You can always...
Yeah, I mean, you can bring in an umpire. I mean, the same way you can bring in a couples therapist, or you could bring in a peer review. You could bring in an outside party who's going to say like, hey, we pre-agreed. I mean, the debunkers do this also. They say like, hey, psychic person, why don't you define the criteria by which we're going to test whether or not you have psychic powers? And the psychic person goes blah, 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 this. And then we go, okay, cool. And then we apply it and it doesn't turn out. We go like, so what are you going to do now? And the psychic person usually just changes their mind. But I mean, I don't think it's impossible. Like we never fully stand out of our entire socially constructed reality, but some of us do stand outside of local sort of debates, I suppose, or
what are the toeholds? We've got to figure out the toeholds because I think there's something
they're
here.
Real. Yeah.
Like,
oh no, it's
bringing in the umpire. Like it's just problematic as bringing in Judge Lance Ito when on the OJ trial, right? The jury and Lance Ito decided that OJ was not guilty, and yet the social fact today is almost uniformly and comprehensively that OJ was guilty.
Except there's a significant difference along racial lines about that fact, that social fact. Still,
that may be true. That may be true.
Yeah.
But I've most brothers and sisters I talk to are like, nah, he did it.
Yeah.
So
I want to use this as a bridge to the future, because we've been talking for a while, and hopefully I imagine people are like listening going like, well, what are these guys offering for the future? And I want to share some ideas that are kind of based on this. So I think we've touched on a couple. Like one is we need to have, I think foundationally, some amount of shared reality about the validation procedure, right? Like design of experiment or what would or would not count as evidence like ahead of time.
Yes.
And a way of essentially, maybe here there's a way of like kind of outsourcing that validation. I mean, replication is one of these things, or some of the innovations in the open science approach, right? Like pre-registration or the publishing of negative results, I think are kind of interesting. If we could incentivize replication through some weird replication funding mechanism, that might be kind of a cool thing. I mean, I don't know. There's a lot of ideas here, but at the very least, we need to have shared reality at the layer of our validation protocols. And then I think the skin in the game. I think skin in the game is a good one. I think prediction markets is one way to create skin in the game. Although, like you said, you actually constrain. Like if we're talking about this kind of like sociological dark matter, where we're just like, what is that shit out there? We haven't even quite figured out how to categorize. We haven't even figured out an encoding method by which we could even make bets. So that's
never mind the GameStop problem, right? Where people can
say
just
more about this, right?
Like, hey, I'm gonna bet on this being true because I so desperately believe in it. I'll throw $5 on it, and I can get 100,000 other people to throw $5 on it because I want that to be determined as true, whether or not it is true. So if it's a betting market that doesn't, where one is not tracking truth but tracking belief, that's extremely problematic. I don't know how to filter that out.
But that's exactly, if what we're talking about simply is a social fact, I mean, the value of a share of GameStop stock is a completely fabricated social fact. There isn't, like, this is classic subjective theory of value, right? There isn't there isn't such a thing as what a GameStop stock objectively is. It
No.
simply is the output of the market forces.
But some people
So
argue, and I'm halfway there with them. Some people argue that to invest, to play in the stock market, and to have a less distorted stock market, you have to be committed in some sense to the future, to what you think the company is going to perform in terms of creating value for customers. And that's a very utilitarian kind of thing. It's also intersubjective. I agree with that.
yes, yes.
But like, if we were talking about Enron and people had knowledge of the antics of Enron and could open the books, 2 months before Enron imploded,
Yep.
there wouldn't have been any way to have insider trading because Enron stock would have gone down based on some perception of Enron's actual performance that was being obscured. So there's got to be some connection to the reality of the business or the reality of the enterprise or the reality of the truth claim that you're making.
Yes.
It can't be a complete intersubjective creation because, quite simply, not those things aren't equally valuable. It's the same with cryptocurrencies. Are we in a bubble right now? Well, what is a bubble? A bubble is an intersubjective false belief where people think at some point the value is going to emerge and more people are going to start using it, or there's going to be this breaking point or this future innovation that's going to be introduced.
Yep.
And yet hodlers are also ideologues. I'm one of them.
They're trying to make it true. They're trying to make it true.
Yes.
Right. Yes. Yes, totally. So this is cool. So I want to bring in one thing here. Like, I think a meta principle here is transparency, right? Yeah. Like this idea that like, hey, there's something about if you can hide information like Enron did, you can actually like promote like a kind of false version of a social fact, right? Like by hiding information, which it's a little bit like the woman who comes into the workplace and goes like, are you guys together or not? Right. It's like, right. It's like, well, that piece of information, now there's more transparency. That changes my perception of what he said, right? Like there's something like this. So, when I think of, these, Jim Rutt and all the Game B people, like one of their principles is, well, more transparency. Like the open source software idea kind of promotes this idea, or the, the economists who believe in efficient markets sort of believe, well, you got to have all the information is got to be priced in. So there's got to be some amount of like transparency of information available. If you kind of have authoritarians who sort of start, controlling speech publicly, you can create and perpetuate like market distortions and just completely undermine the pricing mechanism in ways where you destroy the ability of like a somewhat accurate emergent kind of price calculation in behalf of the economy, which is a problem. So transparency.
Mm-hmm.
But now I want to go right into this fake news thing on this transparency thing altogether. So we got this idea like a photoshopped image, and that was like deep fakes, or now people kind of like get an app called Facetune and make their faces look better, right? All of these ways, or the ways that like a video clip is just decontextualized. Oh, I took a video. Well, who took that video? When did they take that video? Was that staged or was it not staged? Like, yes, it's like, how did that occur, right? Like, and the idea that social media encourages a kind of collapse of context, right? And like the clips get shorter. I mean, I don't know if you go back, if you watch a viral video from like 15 years ago, those things were like 5 minutes long. You're like, oh yeah, look at this. This is funny. Like now I'm like sitting there looking at my watch going like, now I expect my viral video to be fucking like 10 seconds. And
yeah, it's like a TikTok Vine or something.
Yeah. Totally.
Or the clip of Donald Trump saying there are good people on both sides. It's
right.
Like,
It's just that section. That's all you hear.
Yeah, and that is a social fact now that Donald Trump was rooting for the racists. You know what I mean? It's
right.
like
it's a social fact. Yeah. So I mean, this is not going to solve everything, but I want to point to like in this current environment, people are trying to really think about this idea of provenance. Right? Like, how do we know that was real? And, Adobe has come up with this kind of consortium. I think they call it the Content Authentication Initiative or Content Authenticity Initiative. and like, they're deploying sort of tools. Like, can you like can you put an image in and have the tool tell you whether or not that image was modified? Like, that's sort of a simple way of doing it. But if I take that and dial it all the way to the extreme, what I imagine, and I want to run this idea by you. What I imagine is like, if we're talking about science or journalism, or anything that's kind of promoted as facts, any kind of stuff that sort of like gets upregulated in the information ecology along kind of what we call like validated channels. I'm just going to call them that for now.
Yeah.
You have to be able to essentially trace the provenance of all that stuff. So that sort of means like,
oh yeah,
I pop out my camera and I'm like, let me videotape this cop doing whatever, or whatever it is I'm videotaping. It's like, all right, date, timestamp, Michael Porcelli unlocked this phone at this this GPS location at this particular time of day and started videotaping this. You can even say like, he's standing here, he's facing that way, northwest by 33 degrees or whatever. And that gets like encoded into the file and then written in a way that cannot be modified without creating another modified version that is also
a different hash
locked.
Yeah.
A different hash, right? So this is like taking the idea of a blockchain and the idea of an Internet of Things and the idea of like, how do we solve for a fucking post-truth world? And basically saying like, look, you want it to be part of the discourse, the public discourse, it's got to be traceable. And it might not be, it might be edited. It might in the end be kind of like, oh, finding people on both sides, but you can at least click through and go like, show me the whole clip. And the whole clip was like, yes, the whole clip was here by this person at this time. So it's traceable. And if you're off in an anonymous part of the internet, like an 8chan or a 4chan, and you're just like making up shit, the anonymous part of the internet will still be there. Almost like a psychedelic drug trip, right? Just people just making up shit. Blah, 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 blah. But if you want to ever inject like your favorite conspiracy theory into the validated part of the internet, you need to basically go, and this is skin in the game, your reputation. Max Borders took a screen grab off of 8chan at this particular time, in this particular date, in this location. He was sitting in his house, and then he posted it, and then he wrote this opinion saying, I think this conspiracy idea is true at this time and date, and then put it onto the timestamp, and it's indelible. You cannot be undone.
You can come to be known as a propagator of falsehood, not just an initiator of the falsehood, like someone who posts it on 4chan, but someone who takes it off there and shares it. That's interesting. So it's almost like a universe of metadata that gives us more hands on the elephant.
Yes. I think the only solution is gonna have to have chains of provenance. And what's an interesting development? People are all, is this what are they called? The NFTs?
NFT, non-fungible
token. What the fuck is this for? Like whatever, a snapshot of a thing and it's worth $100,000 or whatever. It's like, yeah, but an NFT creates that non-fungibility on the thing, right? In a weird way, like that being the one is like, there's something about what NFTs are doing that I think is workable in this this provenance internet idea, right?
Yeah.
Like, and at least it's traceable. I mean, you could take this really far. You could say like, hey, all the microscopes at school, right? What do they have? Well, they have a little video camera. They have a little time date stamp. It's like you put your thumbprint on it. Right? Like you want to do an actual science experiment, folks. You have to use. I mean, it doesn't mean there aren't microscopes in your like little kitty kit, like teenager version of it. It's just you can't use one of those microscopes to like publish a scientific study, right? You have to, your instrument, whatever it is, your telescope, your microscope, your particle detector, whatever it is, has to say, oh, experimenter so-and-so, accessed and unlocked the thing. They took a measurement at this particular time and date. It uploads it, right? Because a lot of these scientific papers, even from the 90s, it's kind of like you look at a table of data and they're like, where was that data?
How do we know that these aren't fabricated?
The
metadata aren't. So let me
the instruments have to be locked to the data store.
Right. So it has to be some sort of immediate distributed ledger that is censorship 100%. Resistant, all that sort of stuff. So
it has to be cryptographically secured in the hardware on the instrument.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
There's a I'm mixed minds on this point, and I know we're supposed to be talking about collective intelligence, and now we're getting into issues of privacy. But let me just throw it before the end of the show here. We've got a situation where we know that transparency can yield pro-social results. We also know that transparency can yield antisocial results.
Yes.
For example, if I am trying to guard my assets from some authoritarian regime, okay, I won't say which one I worry about, but I think you can probably imagine.
Yeah.
And I don't want to have a chain of provenance associated between me and those assets and where they're stored. Okay. But I still nevertheless want to be able to transact with people all over the world who share my sensibilities. And I want to be able to do that privately. Okay. Because I don't think that I am trying to exit the nexus of the monetary regime in collusion with the federal government, for example. Oh, look, sorry. Now, let's just say that I value that privacy, and out of genuine concern for the collapse of the global economy based on that is currently denominated in the world reserve currency, which is the dollar, that there's going to be some sort of sovereign debt problem in the future. And I want to have some means of storing value and transmitting that value that is independent of the dollar matrix.
Yes.
In one instance, I can have a chain of provenance for all manner of things that would give rise to the blessings of transparency. Okay.
Yeah.
And in another instance, that chain of provenance can make it that everything I do traceable and trackable under the eye of Sauron.
Yes.
And yeah,
it's scary. No, dude, I fucking get it.
Porch is shrugging and with wide eyes, like, holy shit. Yeah, it's like, which way do you go? And I don't know. Right. I don't know the answer to that at all.
Yeah. Yeah. There's an intuition that I have that in order to solve this collective intelligence problem and to kind of mitigate the incentives of spreading false information, that you kind of have to, the skin in the game is your fucking reputation and the traceable provenance back to you, saying utterances at particular times. If you want those things that you're saying to be part of some fucking public discourse, right?
Yeah.
But then on the other hand,
back to David Brennan, by the way, this transparent society.
Right. Transparent society. Yeah, totally. Or you want to be able to kind of like mouth off however the fuck you want, right? Which is kind of like, that's also cool. Go to the workshop in the private room, or go to the fucking 4chan and do it in some kind of shadows or whatever. Who cares? There's all kinds of places where you can still do that. It's just, we've kind of like, we're sort of, what I'm proposing is this idea that what if we improve our epistemics by creating a firewall there that's a little bit like, if you want to leap across from psychedelic world to like validated discourse world, you got to like stake your rep on
this. You got to come into this realm that has all of these different points of coherence that are established through provenance, metadata, and provenance, metadata, and other ways to have hooks into the real world, hooks into what actually happened, and hooks into
I mean, I'm not saying this is I know how you hate voting, but if there is one place where it does seem like there's a really nice protocol design, it's in the idea of an anonymous vote, right? If you kind of go back to the Roman senators or whatever, it's like, Cicero is like, I vote no, right? So or I vote yes. And you sort of know which way they voted. And in a way, you're doing it in a public space and be like, yeah, I want to fucking stab that guy for how he voted, right? I mean, in a way, like the idea of a private ballot where I can just be like, fold the piece of paper, put it in the box. Nobody knows what I said, but I'm saying my thing. This idea of having something that is somehow counted in the, like, we're creating social reality together world, like the counting up of an anonymous ballots, but it's not traceable back to me. At least that's sort of that is a social technology that is currently one of the ones that sort of breaks my idea of like having everything have skin in the game. But maybe that is the future. But I don't know. I don't know. It seems a little, especially in the cancel culture world. It's like, wait a minute, you can't retract. It's like, no retractions, buddy. Like, you said that shit. Done. I mean, you might be like, hey, I'm apologizing for that shit now. Also, that will also be on the validated internet, right? But I mean, these are now two different like transactions on a fucking blockchain of like,
Yeah, I mean,
Max making an ass out of himself and Max issuing a retraction.
This layer, this new layer of the stack is,
Yeah.
For lack of a better metaphor, a double-edged sword.
Yes.
Of Damocles hanging over our heads.
Yes.
Some mixed metaphors.
You want to wrap this up soon? How do you want to bring it home,
I think
dude?
this is a good place to take it home. I think I want to just say to our listeners that this shit is hard. It's really hard. Yeah. This is the human predicament, as W.V.O. Quine said. And it extends to so many features of our lives, particularly now as we have access to more knowledge and more information than we've ever had before. Whether or not it's knowledge is an open question. That takes a measure of wisdom, a measure of circumspection, a measure of the ability to be a fox by dealing in probabilities. And some, as Porcelli has suggested, we need new methodologies. And we need new means of constructing what it even means to be a fact or a truth that we can all agree on. Because in the absence of that, if we're all just dealing in narratives with no cost to being wrong, our information landscape is going to be totally polluted, and the only thing that we can deal with is our immediate surroundings. And even that can be problematic, which is why Michael Porcelli does meta-relating.
Yep.
Weaving shared reality with our fellow human beings is an enterprise, and we're just scraping the surface on how to do that. But I hope that we've inspired some folks out there to show the way.
Yeah. Yeah. My closing thoughts are, I echo what Max said. It's hard. I think, if there's a takeaway I want for you to have, listeners, is like, be aware of like, what are the implicit standards of discourse that you are employing in your conversations, whether you're, having a conversation with colleagues or with an intimate partner or on the internet, on social media, and sort of recognizing how is it that you are assessing this is something that I trust versus not. Like maybe there's sort of certain protocols or certain methodological standards that you hold. But also I want to inspire you to like in a broader level of like, I hope to be convincing that at some level, in order for us to have a shared reality as humanity on this earth, and, if I'm looking towards the future and looking towards us not totally destructing, I do believe there's at least some minimal version of shared reality we need to have with each other. And we need to correct for what's currently happening as a kind of a breakdown in shared reality in our public discourse, which has a huge amount of some of these endogenous risks, these kind of like sort of like social risks that we're creating for ourselves and our ability to kind of proceed into the future without potentially like inflicting major harm on ourselves or each other as a civilization. And like, how would you navigate that? Like, how would you, what kind of conversations are the ones that you trust? What kind are the ones that you feel like get you more clarity or more knowledge or help you maybe correct for your own mistaken beliefs or biases? And what are the ones, where do you see it in others, in your friends and in your communities online where you respect it? And like start to become aware, if you're not already are, of this layer, because
we need people who are aware of that layer to be in a discourse with each other.
Right on.
All right. With that, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for Social Evolution and our conversation on collective intelligence, shared reality, and collective sense making. And we'll see you again next time.
Bye, everybody.